Welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why, and how of newspaper reading. Today, we are going to discuss the New Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 26 September 2018. The news to be discussed today has been presented on the screen before you. Time stamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let's start our today's discussion. The first news appears on page number 1 and also appears as a continuation on page number 10 as well as page number 11. The news reads, enact a strong law to clean politics, as said by the Honorable Supreme Court in a 5-judge constitution bench in the case of Public Interest Foundation and others versus Union of India and others. In your prelims examination, these topics get covered under Indian polity and governance, and in your mains examination, it gets covered under GS paper 2 under governance and constitution. So in this particular news, a 5-judge constitution bench of the Supreme Court has directed the political parties to publish online pending criminal cases of their candidates. And in this direction, the Supreme Court has also urged the Parliament to enact a strong law in order to prevent such candidates who are facing trial for serious criminal offence from standing in elections in India. Earlier, steps were taken by the Supreme Court as well as the Election Commission to restrict candidates facing trial for criminal offences. So earlier, the emphasis was more on a candidate facing criminal charge. But now, in this particular judgment, the Supreme Court for the first time has observed that rapid criminalization of politics can only be stopped by cleansing the political parties. Hence, the emphasis has also shifted on political parties. As you can see, the Supreme Court has also directed the political parties to publish online pending criminal cases of their candidates. So in this aspect, let us go through some of the directions given by the Supreme Court in this particular judgment. The directions of the Supreme Court says that each contesting candidate shall fill up the form as provided by Election Commission, and the form must contain all particulars as required therein. So here all particulars also includes any criminal charges, if any, faced by the candidate. Further, it says that it shall state in bold letters, and this particular point was quite emphasized during the judgment, that with regard to the criminal cases pending against the candidate. So if there is any criminal cases pending against a candidate, then such cases shall be described in bold letters. Further, it said that if a candidate is contesting an election on the ticket of a particular party, he or she is required to inform the party about the criminal cases pending against him or her. So again, here the role of a political party becomes extremely important, which was quite missing in some of the earlier judgments. Some of the other directions as issued by the Supreme Court are: the concerned political party shall be obligated to put up on its website the aforesaid information pertaining to candidates having criminal antecedents. So suppose if a political party is having any candidate who's facing criminal antecedents, then they have to be published on the website of that political party. Further, it says that the candidate as well as the concerned political party shall issue a declaration in a widely circulated newspaper in the locality about the antecedents of the candidate, and also give wide publicity in electronic media. So for the first time, the Supreme Court has also talked about publicizing or making the public aware with respect to any criminal antecedents either in the print media and also in the electronic media. Since we know that the political parties also reach out to its voters through this electronic medium. The Supreme Court, while delivering the judgment, also said that directions has been given with immense anguish, for the Election Commission cannot deny a candidate to contest on a symbol of a party. So the Supreme Court said effectively that they cannot make a rule, and in this regard the Parliament has to enact a law to prevent candidates facing trial for serious criminal offence. Supreme Court further said that a time has come that Parliament must make law to ensure that persons facing serious criminal cases do not enter into the political stream. So the Supreme Court was very concerned with respect to people entering political stream who have serious criminal cases pending against them. You can utilize all these aspects while writing your answer, as these can be expressed as an opinion of the Supreme Court with respect to decriminalization of politics. The Supreme Court further said that the nation eagerly waits for such legislation, for the society has a legitimate expectation to be governed by proper constitutional governance. In this aspect, Supreme Court also mentioned the role of a society which expects a legitimate government governed by constitutional governance, where the voter cry for systematic sustenance of constitutionalism. Now, again, this becomes a very important aspect which was reflected in the judgment of the Supreme Court. It said that substantial efforts have to be undertaken to cleanse the polluted stream of politics by prohibiting people with criminal antecedents so that they do not even conceive the idea of entering into politics. So the Supreme Court in this judgment is very serious with respect to restricting people having facing serious criminal charges against them, and it wants the parliament to enact a strong law. In this aspect, one should also remember that the electoral laws of the countries are also governed by Representation of People Act 1951, where Section 8 of Representation of People Act 1951 provides for conviction for certain offences of certain candidates. Section 8A provides for corrupt practices. Section 9 provides for dismissal for corruption or disloyalty. And Section 10 also talks about disqualification for office under government company. So, the Representation of People Act also provides for certain disqualification under Chapter 3 of Part 2 of the Act. In this aspect, let us also learn certain basics about decriminalisation of politics. It says that decriminalisation of politics means prevention of people having a criminal background or those involved in criminal offences to enter into political arena. As mentioned, that Section 8 of the Representation of People Act 1951 provides for disqualifications to stand for election in case of conviction of certain grounds. Thus, to prevent criminalization of politics, it becomes necessary whether a person who is standing as a candidate in election, whether he or she is facing any serious criminal offences. In this aspect, one must also remember the judgment given in the year 2002 with respect to Union of India versus Association for Democratic Reforms. The Supreme Court of India in this landmark judgment directed the Election Commission to call for information on affidavit under Article 324 on criminal background. So basically, under this judgment, the Supreme Court said that any person who wants to stand as a candidate in election have to disclose cases of any previous conviction, acquittal or discharge along with fine, if they have any, declaration of assets of the candidate along with their spouse, and also including the number of dependents on the person. Then liabilities including debts owed to any financial institution or otherwise, and educational qualification of the candidate. So all these help in making the citizens or making the voters more aware with respect to choosing their candidates in an election. Now, with respect to decriminalization of politics, the Supreme Court had also asked the government to constitute fast track courts, especially for those members of parliament as well as state legislative assembly who were facing serious criminal charges, so that their case could be expedited very quickly or solved in quick time. So the Supreme Court had asked the central government to constitute fast track court along with or the financial requirements necessary to constitute such fast track courts. So in response, the central government proposed to set up 12 special fast track courts to dispose 1581 criminal cases pending against members of parliament as well as state legislatures, and this was in principle approved by the division bench of Supreme Court. In this aspect, the division bench had also directed the central government to allocate roughly around 7.8 crore to respective states for setting up such special courts to fast track cases of such legislatures involved with serious criminal offence. So we understand that the 5-judge constitution bench of the Supreme Court given yesterday will further help the central government in enacting a strong law against those people involved in serious criminal offences. The Supreme Court further said that states shall, in consultation with their respective high courts, shall make these special fast track courts operational by the 1st of March 2018. So we understand that there have certain steps taken by the government with respect to decriminalization of politics. However, this particular 5-judge constitution bench judgment in Public Interest Foundation and others versus Union of India will help in enacting a new law, as the Supreme Court has asked the Parliament to enact a strong law with respect to restricting those people who are facing any criminal charges. Hence, this topic becomes extremely important from our mains perspective, and all the points which we have referred in this analysis can be utilized in answer writing. So now let's wait for the parliament to enact a strong law. When the parliament will enact a law on decriminalisation of politics, we'll definitely discuss the same in further news analysis. With this, let's move on to the next news. The next news appears on page number 13. The news reads, liquidity crisis hits NBFC stocks hard. Concerns related to ILNFS has made investors turn wary of the whole sector. Now this particular news is with respect to the liquidity crisis or cash crunch in the NBFC market. In your prelims examination, this topic forms a part of economy, and in your mains it forms a part of GS paper 3 under Indian economy and issues related to Indian economy. So in this, first of all, let us understand that what's the news all about. It says that India's top 15 non-banking finance companies, that is NBFCs, have together lost over rupees 75,000 crore on the stock market due to fears of a financial crunch in the sector. So we see that there is a fear of financial crunch in the sector of NBFCs. And it is because of this financial fear that most of the NBFC companies have lost roughly 75,000 crore in the stock market. It says that a slide in NBFC stock started after reports that Infrastructure Leasing and Financial Services Limited, that is ILNFS, and its units had defaulted on repayments. So it says that a slide in the NBFC sector started after ILNFS and its unit had defaulted on loan repayments. And this default on loan payments is basically with respect to asset liability mismatch. And this default on loan repayments is basically because of this asset liability mismatch. So let us understand this whole issue of liquidity crunch with respect to this concept of asset liability mismatch in the NBFC sector. Now you must understand that NBFCs raise funds mainly by issuing commercial papers and also by borrowing from banks. Now these commercial papers are instruments on which money is borrowed on short term, and short term here refers to less than a year. So effectively, commercial paper is an unsecured instrument issued to raise loan from the market in the short term. And these commercial papers are in the form of a promissory note with maximum validity for 1 year. So after understanding how NBFCs raise loans, that is through commercial papers and borrowing from banks, let us understand how the liquidity crunch in the market impacted the NBFC with respect to asset liability mismatch. In this aspect, let us understand certain basic facts with respect to loans given by NBFCs. Now, loans given by NBFCs are considered as assets for the NBFCs. And NBFCs mostly give loans for the infrastructure projects. And one must remember that the gestation period for these infrastructure projects are much longer as compared to other financial projects. Now, higher gestation period here means that infrastructure projects takes much longer time in order to give back returns. Now, let us understand this concept in this way. NBFCs take both short-term borrowing as well as long-term borrowing in order to fund the infrastructural loans. And these infrastructure projects, as mentioned, have a long gestation period. So they take much more longer time in order to give back the return. Now NBFCs were earlier borrowing more from these short-term borrowing, that is through raising loans from commercial papers. And this commercial paper had a lower rate of interest. But now the interest rates for short-term loans have suddenly increased. So on one hand, the interest rate for the short-term borrowing have increased for NBFC, and on the other hand, these infrastructure projects to which they have given their loan are taking much longer time to give them back the return on interest. So NBFC have taken short-term loans through these commercial papers with higher interest to fund long-term infrastructure projects, and this is what is creating the asset liability mismatch. And because of this, there is a financial crunch in the NBFC market. So effectively, the rising interest on short-term borrowing through commercial papers has actually impacted the NBFC market, which effectively is further giving loans to long-term infrastructure projects. So this is the actual asset liability mismatch which this particular sector is facing. So in this aspect, let's understand what are the concerns with respect to this NBFC market. It says that the credit rating agencies have downgraded ILNFS rating from high investment grade to junk status. Now, this is a very significant development as it is because of this we are witnessing a crash in the stock prices of these NBFCs. Hence, concerns have been raised that default by the ILNFS would in turn adversely affect the banks, mutual fund companies, and also investment companies that have lent their money to this particular company. Steps taken in this regard is that LIC has said that it will not allow ILNFS to fail as it owns around 25% of ILNFS. And in this respect, it is also planning to inject more equity into the company. Further, the RBI has recently carried out open market operations to purchase G-SECs, that is government securities, to infuse liquidity worth 10,000 crore into the economy. Now, this topic of open market operations carried out by RBI was covered in yesterday's DNS dated 25th September 2018 by Mangal sir. So, to understand this concept of RBI carrying out open market operations with respect to liquidity crunch, you can refer to this particular video of 25th September 2018, which was delivered by Mangal sir. And this asset liability mismatch has also resulted in a liquidity crunch in this NBFC sector. So in this aspect of liquidity crunch, let's go through a question asked by UPSC in the prelims of 2013. The question was that with the supply of money remaining the same, there is an increase in demand for money. There will be a fall in the level of prices, an increase in the rate of interest, a decrease in the rate of interest, and an increase in the level of income and employment. Now we understand that if demand for money increases, considering the fact that the supply of money remains constant, then in such a scenario, we'll definitely see a rise in the interest rate. So in this, B is the correct answer. That is, an increase in the rate of interest will be noticed. So these type of practical questions have been asked by UPSC in the past. So in this aspect, the concept of liquidity crunch hitting the NBFC market, which has also resulted in the crash of stock prices, becomes equally important to understand from our exam perspective. With this, let's move on to the next news. The next news appears on page number 7. It says unemployment among educated youth at 16%. Says study. Report says gap between growth and jobs are widening. Now in this particular news, a new study conducted by Azim Premji University Center for Sustainable Employment throws light on the state of unemployment in the country. And the study is titled as State of Working India 2018. So let's go through some of the highlights as presented by this particular study conducted by the Azim Premji University. So the highlight of this entire report is first of unemployment in the country. Secondly, the report also highlights that the rate at which India has grown, the rate of employment has not grown at parallel, or in other words, rate of growth of GDP is not commensurate with rate of job employment opportunities or growth in job opportunities. And in this aspect, the report has asked the government to come up with a national employment policy to address the serious concerns with respect to employment opportunities. So in this aspect, let us go through some of the important highlights of this particular report. The first highlight talks about gap between growth and job widening, which we just mentioned. It says that higher growth is not leading to higher job creation, and this has led to divergence between growth and job over a certain period of time. It says that during the 1970s and 80s, the GDP growth rate was around 3 to 4% and employment growth rate was roughly 2%. However, in the current scenario, our GDP growth is roughly around 7% or even more. But the employment growth rate has declined to less than 1%. And this is again a matter of serious concern. Further, the article talks about decrease in employment and obviously with respect to it, a rise in unemployment. It says that employment has decreased over the country between 2011 and 2015 with a 7 million drop in employment opportunities. Now this 7 million drop or drop of 70 lakh job opportunities is quite disturbing with respect to Indian scenario. It says that private data has also shown that absolute decline in employment has continued since 2015. So this tendency of decrease in employment or lack of employment has continued even beyond 2015. It is important to note here that among the unemployed youth, the higher educated youth have highest rate of unemployment at 16%. Now this again is a very disturbing trend. This also somehow shows the condition of higher education in India, that most of the higher education is not being able to convert into jobs. The report further points out that wages are rising, but they continue to be well below the 7th Central Pay Commission minimum. It simply means that wages are not being paid properly. It says that a large majority of Indians are not being paid what may be termed as a living wage, and this explains the intense hunger for government jobs. So, this non payment of wages in other jobs is also putting more pressure on government jobs. The report says that nationally, 67% of households reported monthly earnings up to rupees 10,000 in 2015. However, in comparison, the report says that the minimum salary recommended by 7th Pay Commission is that of 18,000 per month. Hence, we again witness a gap of certain amount. Hence, we see that wages are not being paid properly in various sectors. Another important aspect highlighted by this report is that while wages are rising in almost all sectors, the rural wage growth collapsed in 2014. So it talks about a collapse of rural wage growth. And this can be also associated with Narega. So this collapse of rural wage growth again becomes another important highlight of this particular report. And in this aspect, the government should come up with a policy on rural wage growth. Another important aspect highlighted by this report is that there has been an increase in the share of contract work. So we see that there is an increase in contractual work given by various sectors of the economy. And this more contractual work effectively highlights lack of labor law reforms. As in cases of more contractual works, less salary is paid and these jobs are less secured as compared to other jobs in the organized sector. So the report says that there has also been an increase in the share of contract work which offers lower wages and less job security. Thus, all these aspects highlighted by this particular report becomes extremely important, and the government should come up with a policy to address these various issues. The report further highlights certain gender disparities as well as caste disparities among job seekers. It says that women constitute 16% of all service sector workers but 60% of domestic workers. So this again highlights a gender disparity with respect to women. It says women's participation in the paid workforce is low, but some states perform better than the other. Then this report further talks about caste disparities. It says that the caste disparity remains large, but public policy is effective in reducing some of these caste disparities. Here it highlights that Dalits and Adivasis are overrepresented in low paying occupations. For example, they form 46% of leather workers and are severely underrepresented in higher paying jobs. So the report highlights that Dalit and Adivasis, they are more in the low paying jobs and are extremely underrepresented in higher paying jobs. So all these aspects becomes extremely important for us to understand the job scenario of the country with respect to the GDP growth which we are witnessing. So as mentioned, this report calls for a national employment policies. It says that since India's structural transformation has been slower than desired, there is an urgent need to think comprehensively about employment policy, which can take the above trends into consideration. Hence, the study recommends that the government should come up with a national employment policy to look into the various concerns which have been highlighted in this report with respect to gender disparity as well as caste disparity, with respect to wages not being paid properly, with respect to non-payment of wages, which is effectively putting more pressure on government jobs, with regard to collapse of rural wage growth, and also with respect to minimum salary which is being paid to any worker. Thus, the report highlights that the central government must come up with a national employment policy. Thus, this report becomes extremely important to understand from a UPSC mains perspective, as these trends can be utilized while writing answer in reflecting the job scenario and lack of job opportunities in spite of having a decent GDP growth. The next news appears on page number 8 in the editorial section. The news reads, Voters' Choice. The Maldives turns the page on pre-election cynicism with a dramatic result. In this particular news, the joint opposition candidate Ibrahim Mohammed Soli defeated Abdullah Yamin. The outcome of this particular result is especially heartening for India, as Mr. Abdullah Yamin was considered very close to China, and this gives India the opportunity to reset its ties with Maldives. As relations with Maldives had deteriorated over the past, especially after ousting of its president Mohammad Nasheed. Now, this topic of India-Maldives relationship with a complete background was covered in yesterday's DNS by Mangal sir. So, in order to understand the complete background with respect to President Mohammad Nasheed, that how India's relationship with Maldives deteriorated and why this particular electoral result is extremely heartening for India, considering the fact that Abdullah Yamin was very close to China, you must go through the video of Mangal sir in yesterday's DNS. So in this aspect, let's move on to the next news. The next news appears on page number 9 in the conceptual part. It talks about ecological succession. This particular topic in your prelims examination forms a part of ecology and biodiversity. And your mains, it forms a part of GS paper 3, specifically under biodiversity and environment. Now this particular concepts talk about ecological succession. It says that ecological succession refers to progressive changes which happens in the biological structure of a ecological community. So it talks about certain progressive change with respect to time. It then says that succession occurs when a series of communities replace one another due to large scale destruction, which can be either natural or man-made. So these succession can be either natural or man-made. So this particular picture refers to the successive change which takes place in the biological structure of an ecological community with respect to time. As you can see, from 0 years to 1 and 2 years, 3 to 4 years. So here annual plants, then it comes grasses and perennials. Then between 5 to 150 years, we see grasses, shrubs, pines, young oak and hickory. And beyond 150 years, it says mature oak and hickory forest. So we see that with respect to time, there are certain changes which take place in the ecological community, and this change is referred to as ecological succession. Now this ecological succession can be termed as primary succession as well as secondary succession. So let us understand about these two concepts, as question has been asked by UPSC in the past in the prelims examination. Now in the primary succession, it says, in case of primary succession, a region that is uninhabited by any species get occupied. So in case of a primary succession, suppose this is the uninhabited region. Now this particular uninhabited region gets occupied by any particular species over a period of time. It says the first plant to colonize in an area is called the pioneer community. So the first plant to inhabit this particular region would be known as the pioneer community. While the final stage of the succession is called the climax community. The first community is known as the pioneer community and the last community is known as the climax community. The pioneer species are generally microbes, lichens and mosses, and the stages in the development of various communities, that is from pioneer to climax, are called as serial stages. So effectively the stages from the pioneer community to climax community is termed as serial stages. Now secondary succession refers to the sequential development of the biotic communities. And this sequential development of the biotic communities takes place after the complete or partial destruction of existing community. It says that a mature or intermediate community can be destroyed by natural events such as floods, drought, fires or storms, or by human intervention. So this destruction can take place either by natural events or by man-made disaster. Let's go through two questions asked by UPSC in the prelims of 2013 and 2014. The question asked in the year 2013 was, in the grasslands, trees do not replace the grasses as a part of an ecological succession because of. The options were insects and fungi, limited sunlight and paucity of nutrients, water limits and fire, and none of the above. In this, the correct answer was C, that is water limits and fire. The question asked in the year 2014 was, lichens which are capable of initiating ecological succession even on a bare rock are actually a symbiotic association of. In this, the right answer was B, that is algae and fungi. So we see that questions in the past have been asked by UPSC on the concept of ecological succession. So this concept based news on ecological succession becomes extremely important to understand from our UPSC perspective with respect to environment. With this, let's move on to the next news. Now the next news appears as a picture on page number 5, and this picture is with respect to the Bellandur lake in Bengaluru, as this particular lake has again started frothing, and the reason for the frothing of this particular lake is basically caused by chemicals and pollutants. Now I'm mentioning this particular lake because questions have been asked by UPSC in 2018 with respect to either natural lakes or man-made lakes or artificial lakes. And this particular Bellandur lake in Bangalore with respect to its froth has been appearing quite often in a newspaper. So in this respect, let's learn certain basic facts about Bellandur lake and also go through the question asked by UPSC in the year 2018 prelims. This particular topic forms a part of environmental ecology as well as biodiversity. Now this Bellandur lake is in the city of Bangalore and it is the largest lake in this city. This lake is believed to be originally a tributary of Dakshina Pinakini River, which is also known as Ponayar River. If you look in this particular map, you can see that this one is the Ponayar River. Further, it says that the lake itself was constructed during the reign of Western Ganga dynasty, who ruled between 4th to 5th century to 10th century CE. So this becomes very important aspect with respect to this Bellandur lake, that it was constructed, that is it is man-made during the reign of Western Ganga dynasty. On pollution issues, it says that most of Bengaluru's treated and untreated sewage is released into the Bellandur lake, and this severely pollutes it and also results in the depletion of wildlife in and around the lake. So this is the concern with respect to Bellandur lake, that because of releasing of treated and untreated sewage into the Bellandur lake, it is resulting in lots of pollution of the lake, which also results in froth coming in the lake. So in this aspect, let's go through this particular question asked by UPSC in the year 2018. The question asked was, which one of the following is an artificial lake? The options were Kodaikanal, Kolleru, Nainital and Renuka. In this, Kodaikanal is the right answer, as Kodaikanal is an artificial lake. So in this aspect, important aspect with respect to Bellandur lake is that it is in the city of Bangalore. It is believed to be originally a tributary of Ponnayar river, and the lake was constructed during the reign of Western Ganga dynasty, who ruled between 4th to 5th century to 10th century CE. And the issue of release of treated and untreated sewage into the lake, which is resulting in froth coming in the lake. Hence, this news becomes extremely important. With this, we come to an end to discussion of today's newspaper. Let's move on to the question for the day.